about how can you be more proactive in these types of conversations around race as well as about racial injustice.
Mhm. So let's think about the lifespan, and sometimes it's easier for folks, particularly for folks who are interacting with children, to think about what are the things that they're kind of into and interested in, and what's developmentally appropriate. So, as I mentioned, books was something that was really important, and imagery, right? So we think of very young children, infants, toddlers, as really getting information as a result of their environment and through their senses. And so books become really important in ways. So buying books, actually had a conversation with a children's book editor who talked about, from an anti-racist framework, the fact that even though there are more books today for my child than there were likely when I was growing up that we're able to purchase for him, that have, a variety of characters, et cetera. So folks self-publish books, et cetera. She talked about the fact that the buying of those books really differs. So for example, you may find parents of color intentionally buying books, right, that have more a racial ethnic representation. She challenged the notion. This was a white identified children's book editor who talked about the fact that white parents, in her experience, were less likely to buy books with characters that feature a variety or diversity of racial and ethnic characters. So I would say to white parents, right, be intentional as well, in the same way that I am intentional for my child about buying books that have representation, and that's true representation, as well as images that are a direct reflection of himself. For white parents, that's important too. So what are the toys? What are the puzzles? What are the books that you're reading? What are the things that you're selecting with regard to media? So the characters, on TV shows, et cetera, are things that you can be intentional about early on. And then it's about introducing language. So noticing, oh, wow, look, so you, even within your family, right, individuals have different skin tones, is likely the case, but noticing in a way that appreciates. So I think it's the connotation, the tone of voice, the appreciation of the fact that different individuals may have different skin tones and skin colors. And what's the messages that we then want to communicate about that? So now, even though it's not ideal for me as a Black parent to have conversations, we've gone from noticing that maybe, my son's skin color may be more similar to mine than to his dad's, than to a cousin's, noticing those things and appreciating them and saying, we all can kind of look different. And we're also introducing, as separate from racial categorization, right, ethnicity and ethnic identity development to him. We're now adding on these sort of conversations as we read more books, because there are children's books about things like racial injustice and civil rights movement. So I'm introducing some history to him now. And we're noticing how, remember, we talked about those different skin tones. And we're reading the book that maybe, provides the history. I can talk about how folks, his skin tone, or other folks that may be, daddy's skin tone, or brown folks, which is his language. I do try to use his language. I say Black, but he's always like, my skin is brown, which is accurate. So we talk about how folks with brown skin at one point in time in history, right, could not sit in the same places, or how we go to the restaurant, right? It's fine. We find ways to talk to kids about so many things and to teach them so many things, which is why I say we have to check ourselves as adults. It's the topic of race being uncomfortable for people that really prevents them. All of a sudden, it's so hard. It's not. I mean, in the same way that you can figure out how to, when kids ask the darndest questions and we have to figure out a way to explain it. I, as someone who's been doing this work for so long, still pause. I take a deep breath. He asks questions, and I try to work my way through it in language that he can understand using his lens. You know how you have a classroom and you go to school and you've got friends that all have different skin tones? Well, in history, that wasn't always the case, right? So now I can explain a little bit. And he was frustrated in terms of, so now developmentally, you need to pay attention to kids' emotions as you start introducing that. And we had already been having conversations about having big emotions and what that means. And so he has a language, right? It all goes together. And so I noticed as I was reading one of the books about the Tulsa, Oklahoma sit-ins and protests, that his face was all furrowed. And so I stopped and I said, what's going on? How are you feeling? What's going on? And he's just like, I'm really frustrated. And I said, oh, this is so frustrating, right? Validate his feelings, right? It's really frustrating to hear that people were not allowed, right, because they were brown, to go into a restaurant and just to get something to eat and sit down like we do now, that sort of thing. I also emphasized for him that the struggle continues. I mean, so it's not that this is just in the past, but it's about finding, again, the language, He knows he's in a classroom. I know what his classmates look like. I know where I bring him, you know, for example. So also being intentional about where are you literally existing and bringing your children. So that
Opposed to what she's saying to him. And so I think it's really important point that you touched on about making sure that you're not just having these conversations with your kids about racism and anti-racism, but also that you're behaving in ways that also support an anti-racist viewpoint, and that you get involved in teaching them how they can also navigate some of these things and maybe speak out when they recognize injustice as well.
yes, right. Because I also think it's really important for parents and caretakers and adults who interact with kids to understand that you're also modeling that it's a journey for you. There's not an end point, you know, to anti-racism. It's a continued process. We're constantly working at it, you know, is the idea.